Hello everyone, I want to talk a little bit about episode 2 of Westworld called Chestnut. After I saw the episode, I went back and rewatched the original film with Yul Brynner. And I was struck after reading some of the recollections of Michael Crichton on working on the movie. He noticed that upon viewing the rough cut, the audience was laughing in the wrong spots, and there was some tension in the wrong spots, and it just didn't work the way he wanted it to. And part of that was due to a lot of studio meddling. It was also the first film to use digital image processing. And he got a quote from this laboratory in Pasadena, I think it was called Jet Propulsion, and he found out that it was going to take 9 months and cost $200,000 for 2 minutes of animation. So he actually, if I'm recalling, had a friend's son work on it instead. And, viewing the film, I'm hard-pressed to give you an example of a scene that had digital effects. It wasn't very prominent at all. A lot of the rules of the film, and we'll touch on this in a minute, but a lot of the rules are just not, they just don't make sense, with the guns that have heat sensors and things. It just doesn't add up to me. But so Crichton actually said, I'm gonna read this. Everyone remembers the scene in Westworld where Yul Brynner is a robot that runs amok. But there is a very specific scene where people discuss whether or not to shut down their resort. And Crichton says that he thinks the movie was as much about that decision as anything else. They just really didn't think it was going to happen. So for him, it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of technology. It wasn't really meant to be a thriller. And it does bring to mind Jaws. The beaches must stay open on the 4th of July. But that chestnut, if you will, from Michael Crichton is the central conceit of this episode as well. And when Dr. Ford is talking to his chief narrative officer later. What is his name? And I'm going to talk a little bit about how some of these characters are just not clicking with me. But yeah, Dr. Ford and Lee Sizemore are arguing, and Lee Sizemore wants to have more spectacle, more romance, more danger, just like a narrative on rails, in which the guest is sort of like a passive observer. And Dr. Ford is more indicating that his vision of Westworld is a place where someone can find out who they really are or who they can be. It's less about them passively interacting in something that's just all flash with no substance. He wants all substance. But we'll touch back on that more in a minute. So, in the beginning, it was very interesting to see the two guests checking in. The way they boarded the train, I liked very much as well. You got to kind of ask yourself, was the train sort of stopped until they got on and then it started moving? Or did they somehow take a shuttle that sort of loaded them onto the train while it was in motion? But it was very, very slick. The opening scene where they're getting dressed and he has to pick between a white hat and a black hat. That was obviously telling on many levels. Talking about what Dr. Ford said about Westworld helps you find who you really are or who you could be. So the check-in process was very interesting. I did like that. The second episode, taking these two characters who are obviously, fill-ins for the two stars of the original movie. It's William and Logan, and they're a mirror for Richard Benjamin as Peter Martin and James Brolin as John Blaine, the two stars of the original movie. And that's what the pilot was sort of missing, were these two characters, one of whom is very hedonistic, and the other one whom, if you look at the movie as a template, will actually survive this, is approaching things in a more realistic way, a more sort of introspective way. They start in the center, which is simple and safe, and his friend mentions that, the further outside you get, the more intense things become. And all you have to do is make choices. And isn't that just like life? All you have to do is make choices. At one point, I think it's William says, is she real? And his friend says, if you can't tell, does it even matter? And that's a very interesting question to think about. If an experience is so real, you're not sure if it's reality, does it even matter anymore? What is reality? That's the sort of question that Westworld is trying to, grapple with. And is it too lofty of a goal for this show? Which has been plagued by some delays and some casting changes and things like that. So you have to hope that they have the narrative focus. And like I said last week, it doesn't fall into that J.J. Abrams trap of just mythology that just builds and builds and adds up to nothing. Hopefully they have a better end game than that, and hopefully they can maintain the story. because the original movie doesn't give them much to work off of. It's robots go amok, no one knows why. It's an early reference to a computer virus. And the whole movie is a little bit silly. He throws acid on him and it doesn't affect his clothes. And I kept waiting for the scene from the movie poster where, Yul Brynner, like half his face is off. It never actually happened in the movie. His whole face pops off at the very end for 2 seconds. Maybe that was one of the digital effects. It looked like a practical effect to me, though, like they had like a dummy with the face hollowed out. So Teddy and Dolores not given a lot to do this week. The pilot really centered around them, but this week they were more off to the side. And we don't really advance the central plot of Dolores. Dolores knows, what she is, and she knows what's going on in Westworld. And we don't really see that advance much, but that's sort of probably late game, narrative. So as I said before, the central idea of this particular episode is the idea, from a plot standpoint, the idea that the hosts may not dream, but they can access memories. So the fact that Ford coded into them these reveries, where they're actually able to more actively access memory, is a very troubling thing, because they're accessing these memories and it's confusing them and it's altering their programming to a certain extent. So when Maeve remembers in a dream or in a reverie how to wake herself up, and she wakes up on the operating table outside of the resort, that was a great scene. And she obviously is very, very, very upset. She doesn't know how to cope with her reality. They know her name. I love the little character moment where one of the surgeons says, Maeve, relax, and she's like, he knows my name. How does he know my name? Who is this? And she sees all the bodies stacked up, and she sees even Teddy with the bullet holes in him. She sees Teddy. And they're obviously going to wipe this, but it's still in there somewhere, so she can access it later. And I think it's slowly going to build where these robots become self-aware. I mean, that seems like where it's going. And if Ford is playing God, another great moment, I didn't touch on this yet, but between Ford and Jeffrey Wright, I can't think of his character's name, but he says, talking about Occam's razor, and he says that Occam would have had them burned at the stake for witchcraft, because of the way that they're actually playing God and controlling life and death. So the scenes with Ford walking through the desert with a young boy who's obviously a robot that he based upon himself. I mean, they have the same father, they have the similar accent, they're even wearing the same clothes, which to me is sort of that like fake out where you have to dress the younger version like the older version, or else the audience is too stupid to get it, right? It's the thing that Red Letter Media said, Captain Picard lost a bet, because in, I think it was Nemesis, they show a picture of Captain Picard and he has a bald head, but he's 20. So did he lose his hair at 20, or did he lose a bet? Because if they showed him a young man with a full head of hair, the audience would say, well, who the hell's that? And then he makes the joke that if it was going to be a young Han Solo in the prequels, he'd have to be dressed the exact same way with the vest, or we wouldn't understand who he was. So that was pretty obvious right away that it's a young boy he based on himself. And this shrine in the middle of the desert now, I hope this doesn't become like the hatch from Lost, but this shrine is the next real adventure, the next real story that Ford's working on, and it's going to have much more substance than what Sizemore was pitching, which was all flash. That's the main question that this episode raised, was what is he planning? And we're still wondering what sins he has to atone for. Ford is a very interesting character. But there's one character who is looking for something even deeper than that, than whatever Ford's looking for, and that is the Man in Black. Week 1, you have to look at a man dressed in black as a gunslinger as a mirror for the Yul Brynner gunslinger, but no. This person is clearly a guest based on the rules, which the show is holding to a little bit loosely. I don't want to get too off topic, but the original film handled it very poorly, where the gun has a sensor and it can only shoot something with body heat. Well, if the robots have no body heat, I mean, I don't know how realistic the prostitutes would be if they were ice cold. But at the same time, why would they give the gunslinger a gun with real bullets that could kill a guest? You'd think it would be just like blanks that he'd be shooting. Unless they want to shoot each other, it's very difficult. And then when you bring in like medieval world or Roman world, there's daggers and swords. It's all based on the programming at that point. And what's stopping one guest from killing another guest with a sword? I think that's one of the reasons that in this show they didn't touch on the whole Delos sort of superstructure with medieval world and a Roman world. But anyway, so the Man in Black is looking for the deeper level of this game, and he's on a quest like he's playing a video game he wants to win, and he's looking for achievement points for his gamer tag. It seems like he is bound and determined to get 1,000 on this game. And the scenes where he saves the man from a hanging only to kill everyone because he's untouchable, which proves he's a guest as well. But the little girl says to him, the maze is not for you. Lucky that it was the little girl who knew and not the wife who he just killed, right? So she tells him how to find the entrance to this maze. So the whole thing reminds me a little bit of Neo trying to find the architect a little bit. And then I would hate to think that we get to this maze, we get to the last level, and it's just more questions, which is probably what it's going to be. But that is the other main question, is what is the Man in Black trying to find? And he says at one point, he's been coming to this resort for 30 years, and in a way, he was born there. So perhaps, like we said before, he found who he really was in this park and became someone new. And now he's trying to find what the end game is. He's trying to find meaning. If he was born there, he wants to find his maker. Is he trying to get to Ford? Do they know each other? Or does he just simply have a relationship with the resort and the world itself? And did Ford actually program in a deeper level in this maze? And if so, to what end? Just as an Easter egg for very, very persistent guests? That's the other thing that I really do want to know. So Bernard, that's his name. He is a character. I do like him. He's a little bit stiff. He seems very detached from both the park and the storyline. He seems like he's watching the action just like the audience is. He's the heir apparent to Ford, but he's not that interesting of a character yet. And his relationship with Teresa Cullen is just, I don't care. Luke, I had to look on the wiki, Luke Hemsworth as Ashley Stubbs, the head of security. I have no idea who that is. And then, of course, Teresa Cullen, she's just angry. And, she answers to the board, but she doesn't care. And she's just like a non-character for me at this point, too. So Ashley Stubbs and Teresa Cullen, I don't know who they are. I don't really care at this point. I'm sure as the show moves on, it'll flesh them out. But I'm not that interested in having side characters fleshed out. I said it before, and I'll say it again. I wish the show could just be a nice tight 10 episodes about the robots, about Ford, the Man in Black. Solve it, have an end game. Don't, drag it out to season 2, season 3, and it just keeps getting, and we're still wondering, and we still don't know anything. That would be frustrating. They would lose me if that happened. I had the same problem with Man in the High Castle. I watched the whole first season, and at the end, there was really no answers. There was just more questions. We don't really know anything. So I'm debating if I'm going to actually, devote the time to watch season 2 of that. So I'm hoping Man in Black. I'm hoping Westworld does better and can actually have a tight narrative focus and have a self-contained story in season 1. If we go to a season 2, that's fine, but I don't want season 2 to still be, Dolores knows something and we don't know when she's going to react, and Teddy's confused and the Man in Black's looking for the maze still in season 2. I really don't want it dragged out like that. They tell you right at the opening of the first movie that they're robots. But in the show, if you didn't know going into it, that first act of the first episode worked really well because you don't actually know that there are robots unless you're familiar with the premise. But you also don't know who is a robot. Like I said before, I was convinced Teddy was a guest. And then when they killed him, the Man in Black killed him, you assume the Man in Black is the Yul Brynner character. And Teddy's going to kill him and say, wow, this resort's great, but it was the other way around, which I thought was really well done. That was it had me fooled. And I really did appreciate that. So a lot of promise here, a lot of heavy actors, a lot of really good actors in this, a couple of non-characters that they have to flesh out, and a lot of questions still to be answered. This was a good episode. I think the two, there was 3 really great set pieces. The one with Maeve waking up on the table and her recurring dream. The one with the Man in Black trying to get the information from the man and his family about the maze. Really great shootout as well. And of course the scene with Ford talking to his younger self and planning the next phase of the park. Also the scene where Ford shot down, and these names are not sticking because they're just not great characters to me, Sizemore. shot down his idea. He just goes, nope, we're not going to do that. And it was probably like, months of work creating these robots and building the storyline. And you've got to think about the programming too, to have them programmed in a way that they're going to follow this narrative path. And what Ford's looking for is really a very open-ended, open-world sandbox where there are no missions, which reminds me a little bit of EVE Online, where there's no real mission or story for the average pilot. It's just, here's this world, there are some rules, but you can do and be whatever you want to be. And in some ways, EVE Online reminds me of Westworld, because if you want to be a pirate and blow people up all day and kill people and steal their stuff, you can do that, and there's no rule against it. If you want to be a good person, relatively speaking, and just, look for data sites and, transport cargo or mine asteroids, you can do that too. So it's really, part of it lets you act out on these desires that you have, to be a good guy or a bad guy, or to be, a hero or a villain. And it reminds me also of RPGs, where you have to make decisions, and the whole game is about decisions. And, do you go Renegade or Paragon? And I think it's fun sometimes to go full Renegade, but even though it's a video game, when it comes time to kill all the space children on the station, Fallout 3 is a good example, where you have to blow up Megaton. I can never bring myself to do it, because I just don't have that inside me to actually blow up a town, even though it's a video game. It's fun. If I've done it, I always go back and reload a previous save, because I don't want to live in that kind of a world. But that's what Ford is trying to capture, is that feeling where your choices actually matter, and you're given an insight into who you are and who you can be. And that's what Sizemore doesn't understand. So looking forward to episode 3. Leave me a comment, let me know what you think, and we'll see you next time.